Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pacific Front Untold. Last week, we began the Powell family story with J.B. Powell, the American journalist who operated the China Weekly Review in Shanghai and was imprisoned and tortured by Japanese authorities after Pearl Harbor. And today, we return to the next generation, his son, John W. Powell. After the war, Bill Powell continued the family tradition of journalism in China through the China Monthly Review. But during the Korean War, he published reports concerning allegations that United States had used biological warfare. And these reports eventually placed him at the center of one of the most extraordinary press freedom cases of the Cold War. And so today I'm joined again by Thomas Powell, John Powell's son, to discuss his father's journalism and then the biological warfare controversy and the sedition prosecution, and what it was like for a family already shaped by wartime imprisonment to find itself confronting another powerful government. So, Tom, can you bring us up to date on your father in China where we left off in the last episode?
Yes. Um, Bill left China in 1941 at the urging of his father to go back to school at the University of Missouri. That it was obvious to everybody in Shanghai that the Japanese were going to invade, and it was going to get really ugly there. And so he sent Bill home. And so he was in school at Missouri when the war broke out on December 7th, 1941. And then JB, of course, as we discussed last week, was arrested by the Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, and tossed into a prison and got really sick. And he was repatriated in 1947. And Bill joined the army, or he actually he wasn't drafted because of his poor eyesight, but he was hired by the OWI, the Office of War Information, because he had been in China and knew about China, and China was one of the big battlegrounds of World War II. There had been this ongoing second Sino-Japanese War since 1937, raging throughout the coastal regions of China. And so he was sent to collect information in China and to act as a news gatherer behind or inside of China. And so he was stationed first in Chongqing, where the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek had established its headquarters. And then later he was sent to smaller cities to report on activities that were going on. And he also brought news from the United States to inform Western and English-speaking Chinese of the activities of the war in Europe and in the Pacific Islands. So he was in China throughout the duration of World War II. And so as soon as the war ended, he quit his job with OWI and made his way back to Shanghai. And so he got there and he found that the review offices had been completely ransacked, that the office had been destroyed. And so he decided that he was going to reopen it, that he was going to get the office and get the newspaper up and running because he expected his dad to recover and come back and resume editorship of this news magazine, and he was gonna set it up. And so that's what he did. He began publishing again at the end of 1945.
And
And
that's very exciting. So, can we go back and talk about Chongqing, where he was, Chongqing, or yeah. So there was a lot of wartime bombing in Chongqing, right, during his time there as an OWI officer.
Yes, he witnessed quite a bit of the war there, but he didn't stay in Chongqing that long. He was, I forget the cities, but he was assigned to, he covered General Chennault and his airlift campaign to Burma and India, and he roved around. He had quite a bit of freedom of mobility. So he got around. He was very agile and was able to kind of make his way.
Cool. Yeah, so what was after he kind of reestablished the office, so it went from China Weekly Review to China Monthly Review, right? And so what was China Monthly Review trying to accomplish after World War II?
Well, it took a while for it to go to a monthly, and that was after he experienced. That was after he'd been publishing for a couple of years, and after my mother had arrived. My mother is really important in this story too, because she and Bill were partners uh, in everything they did in their lives, and so she came to China in 1945 at the end, working with the United Nations Relief Agency, UNRWA. And she was hired away from UNRWA by Madam Sun Yat sen to be her appointment secretary. And so she was working for Madam Sun, and her politics became quite radicalized working for Madam Sun. And she and Bill met. There was a small American community there, and they developed a romance and got married in 47. And my brother John was born in 49, and I was born in 51. And uh, they witnessed right from the front row the communist revolution in China, that they were in Shanghai when the Red Army captured the city. And so then they had this opportunity with their paper to witness the development of the new People's Republic of China as it was happening in the streets. And after these years of Kuomintang mismanagement and the disruption of this constant war and struggle against Japan, things were disastrous. There was so much that needed to be fixed and repaired, streets and sewers and childcare centers and education and markets and sanitation. And the communists were very effective at cleaning things up. They immediately started arresting all the worst thugs of the Kuomintang era and initiated a huge cleanup campaign. And so they witnessed this honeymoon period, the first about 5 years from 45 to 50 of the success of the Communist Party and their policies in China. And they wrote
Wow.
about it in the review.
And
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually remember seeing the copy, a picture of your mom with Song Qingling, and for our audience who are confused or is a little bit lost, KMT that was fighting for China was Chiang Kai-shek, who is the husband of Song Meiling, and Song Qingling was actually married to the founder um, of modern China, Sun Yat-sen, and then later became, I think, the vice president for Mao, and she stayed behind in China. And it's fascinating for me to see this in your book, this one picture in your book of your mom having tea time with Song Qingling, the
yeah,
youngest, the
that's a
youngest
very
one.
interesting photo because uh, Madam Sun was very much in demand socially, that everybody wanted to talk to her. And she was, Mao was kind of not a public speaker. He was a tremendous organizer and poet and philosopher king, but he was inarticulate and he didn't like meeting foreigners. He didn't speak English, and so she was the front, the face of the revolution. And my mother kind of ran her social calendar for her. So that photo
Wow.
shows Madame Cripps and or Lady Cripps from Great Britain, and Madame Sun has placed Sylvia right between them as a buffer.
Yeah.
It's
It's
kind of, yeah,
yeah.
interesting photo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Wow. Yeah. So China Monthly Review then was like kind of like showing what the Communist Party was doing post-war, between 1945 to 1950, to for the Western audience to understand what the Communist Party was about, because I'm pretty sure by this time there were a lot of propaganda or other statements. For example, the Time magazine probably was still running Chiang Kai-shek as like the democratic leader, and also there was a civil war going on. But your parents were writing about how they were fixing
yeah,
China.
they wrote, well, they were young. You could see in the photo they were in their
Yeah.
early 30s by this point, and uh, they were idealistic, and they thought that they were very impressed with the improvements that the Communist Party had done and was doing. And they wrote about it glowingly, and they had been very disaffected with the corruption of the Kuomintang, that towards the end of this regime, you needed wheelbarrows of money to make payroll, and it was chaotic and it was good
Wow.
riddance. And so what happened and why the newspaper or the magazine shrank was because they were subsidized by the Kuomintang for newsprint. That newsprint was imported and it was expensive, and so the cost of it was very dear. And as soon as they became overly critical of the Kuomintang, they lost their newsprint subsidy. And Bill couldn't afford to buy the amount of newsprint needed to run a weekly. And so he had to buy it on the black market. So that was one of the big reasons, not that there wasn't news,
Right.
but that they just couldn't afford to put the magazine out on that frequently.
Wow. And so did your father, since his boots were on the ground, did your father believe American reporting on China at this time had become kind of distorted by Cold War politics, or just
Yeah, he definitely felt that way. He thought that the real picture was not being seen in the West. Both my parents were convinced that, there was a campaign to discredit the Communist Party, not to recognize it. And they were appalled by how reactionary the Truman administration had become. That the Truman administration was supporting the French in Vietnam and was supporting the Dutch in Indonesia that were trying to recolonize. And he was unhappy about that. He thought the U.S. should honor its tradition, its revolutionary tradition, and support these independent movements. And so he railed against that, and that didn't win him any friends either. But what put the review out of business really was not just the American community abandoning Shanghai and the advertising dried up, but the U.S. Postal Service quit delivering it in the United States.
wow.
And they didn't announce it. They just established a policy of outright censorship to all magazines and journals that originated in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union or China. And they just sent them to incinerators and landfills and never delivered them. And so the subscriptions fell off, and they had no income. And that really was the final kind of blow.
Yeah, and so I found this edition of China Review where he was actually talking about biological warfare, and I think that was one of the first things that probably got him into trouble. And so, how did he first encounter allegations that the United States was using biological warfare during Korean War?
I think he first heard about it and first read about it through the Kharbarov's war crimes trial that the Soviet Union held in Kharbarovsk in 1947. That that news was suppressed in the United States. Nobody in America received that word and knew anything about it, but the rest of the world knew very much about it, and so he definitely heard about it. And this was the testimony of General Otozo, I think his name was, and a bunch of his subordinates that they had engaged in bacteriological warfare, and they were convicted on various of these charges and were imprisoned in the Soviet Union. And so that's when most people in the world heard about this BW campaign.
Yeah, but a lot
And
of
this was the one in World War II. Okay,
yes,
this was we've got to separate that. There was a BW campaign operated by the Japanese in World War II in China and Russia. And then there was the Japanese and American campaign that was operated in Korea during the Korean War.
yes, and so, but a lot of times, like a lot of Western media at the time was kind of just saying that the Soviet Union trial was a communist propaganda. And how did your father like see through that?
Well, trials in the Soviet Union and in most of the rest of the world are very different from American trials. American trials are show trials, and it's theater, and you have the defense and the prosecution, and they battle it out, and there's surprise witnesses and there's surprise testimony and stuff. And most trials in most countries are administrative affairs. The prosecutor runs the show, and it's the prosecutor's job to take the police evidence and turn it into a case. And then usually the accused confess, and then they're sentenced by the judge, and the whole thing is administrative. Okay, it's a very different form of
Right.
the accuracy is more or less the same in terms of how many innocent people go to prison as any other, as in the U.S. Here there's a lot of innocent people go to prison because they have to plea bargain, and that's not particularly fair either. That's a real tyranny, and so but there was
Yeah.
no show, and the American audience needed show, and the newspapers ignored it, and it
And
was easy just to denounce it because Russia was now our new enemy.
yeah, and this article that he had in March 1952 was quite something because it was so detailed in the way he covered how this was happening. And the title was Crime Against Humanity in the Month in Review. And it also talked about, of course, Korean prisoners being massacred. And I think it was by the statement by Foreign Minister Bak Hong Young in protest to the United Nations on February 22nd, revealed in detail the use of bacteriological weapons by the US forces in Korea. So he is not really reporting anything new. This is a statement to the United Nations, right? And so by this time, like, is that the evidence that persuaded him that the allegations deserve to be published? Like, what evidence persuaded him to publish this piece of article?
Well, I think that the activities of the war up to this point were really horrific. And the nature of the war is not understood by Americans, just how brutal and violent it was. But after MacArthur launched the Incheon invasion there. The U.S. Army captured Seoul and camped out there for a couple of weeks. And the only building, substantial building that was not bombed, was the beer factory. And so MacArthur liquored up his soldiers for a couple of weeks. And then while Truman prevaricated and couldn't make up his mind whether he wanted to invade North Korea or not, MacArthur said, to hell with it, and he invaded. And he knew there were Chinese soldiers. He had decent intelligence, but he pretended he didn't. And that invasion of North Korea is one of the most brutal and vicious and ugly invasions of the 20th century. It rivals the Nanjing massacres for viciousness. And there was a book or a pamphlet that was published by the WIDF, the Women's International Democratic Front or Foundation, was an agency of the United Nations that had heard rumors about the brutality that was going on there, that whole villages were being lined up and gunned down and bulldozed into trenches, that women especially were being gang raped and brutalized and having their limbs cut off. It was a god-awful affair, and the North Korean army could not prevent it. They could not prevent this initial American invasion because they were in disarray from the American attack. And it wasn't until the Chinese army intervened and pushed the Americans back out of North Korea that there was some semblance of order and peace in North Korea. And that's one thing that really needs to come out now and really needs to be made public, is just how ugly that was, and the effect, the psychological effect that had on the American soldiers, that American soldiers died from suicide and from just a give up itis, it was called, at an alarming rate, just staggering, especially in the POW camps. And it was because they were Christians and they'd been ordered by their government, by their officers, to murder women and children in the most awful way, just heaping their bodies into pits. And so this needs to be heard. And this really, more than the bacteriological warfare, I think needs to come out. And this report that was done by the women's organization needs to be made public.
Yeah, I heard so much about how, well, actually, not a lot of people know that the civilian population was heavily impacted during the Korean War. I think it's like more than 50% of the casualties were actually civilians in the Korean War.
Probably way more than that. The
Yeah.
Korean War, there was about 4 million Koreans that were killed during the Korean War, and about half of them were killed by bombing campaigns, and especially the use of napalm, which burned people and even suffocated people because the flames consumed the oxygen. People that were hiding in underground in basements and caves were still killed by these firebombing. And so that was most of it. But there was unbelievable massacres that occurred during these first 2 months of the U.S. invasion of North Korea. There was probably a quota, because it reads like that when you read the record of the women's group and then the lawyers group. There was an international lawyers group that went, truth-finding commission that went, and they exposed numerous instances where people been herded into basements and set on fire. Not small numbers, like 400 people in one instance, or 900 people in a village.
Wow.
It's just over and over again. And
Yeah.
so these facts need to come out, and there needs to be a reconciliation. And we wonder why the North Koreans hate us so much and so rabidly anti-American? Well, it's because we lie and deny that we did these crimes.
Yeah, and the article keeps then went on and said the record of American preparation and use of bacteriological weapons in Korea is a long one. Last March, a U.S. naval ship under Crawford F. Sams, chief of public health and welfare section of the UN Forces General headquarters, sailed to Wonsan on the east coast of Korea. Although masquerading as an epidemic control ship, it was actually loaded with bacteriological installation and was used for testing germ weapons on North Korea and Chinese prisoners. This actually sounds awfully like Unit 731, except Unit 731 was on land, and uh, this so-called epidemic control ship was actually on water. And how did he hear about the situation of what the epidemic control ship was doing?
Well, he's a journalist, and journalists have their sources, okay?
Okay,
But
yeah,
I confirmed that paragraph right there, and I actually produced a book on it. General Sam's bubonic plague ship
yes,
was discovered, and this boat still exists, remarkably enough. But Sam's was a first class son of a bitch, and he had on board with him three of the most notorious of the Japanese BW war criminals. He had Ishishiro, he had Wakamatsu, and he had Katano. All three of them were on board. They were giving him a demonstration of Japanese BW, because he was the money man that was paying for it out of the United States Army budget. And I think that Bill's sources are both Chinese sources and Western sources, that there were Westerners in China who were, especially two reporters, Wilfred Burchett and Alan Winnington, who were reporting the Korean War inside North Korea, that they were embedded with the Chinese army. And
yeah,
so he knew Burchett. Burchett was a personal friend, and he was getting reports back, and this information is novel and new to us, but it was, being reported by Chinese newspapers as well in China. It wasn't a secret.
yeah. It says that even commenting on the activities of the ship, the April 9th, 1951 issue of Newsweek under the headline "Bubonic Plague Ship" stated, look for news on the secret mission of a Navy epidemic control laboratory ship to Wonsan Harbor. So even Newsweek knew about this. But then for some
Yeah.
reason, like it's kind of like a blank for us in terms of like history classes, in terms of like what happened in Korean War, or like why this is even a controversial topic still up to this day. Um yeah, that's wild. And also connecting to like Japan's wartime biological weapons program. How much at this point of like 1952 did your father know about the Japanese biological warfare program? Like, did he know for a fact at this point that the Japanese scientist from Unit 731 was working for General Sam?
I don't think he knew that part. I think that's something that's come up later. That's something that I kind of found out uh, in my research later on. We'll talk about that next week. But he knew a great deal about it. He knew that the U.S. He knew that Ishishiro had managed to flee Harbin and that death camp, the Pinfan death factory that they were operating up there, that he and his top staff had killed all their victims, incinerated the bodies, dynamited the plants, and had beat a hasty retreat back down to Tokyo. And they were hiding out in the suburbs of Tokyo. And so Uh, so he knew that they had then made contact with the Americans, and that the Americans that MacArthur was well aware of Unit 731 by about 1943. They had unearthed this death factory, and they knew a great deal about it and where it was and stuff and who the principals were. And MacArthur wanted that knowledge. Okay, MacArthur's plans were big. He was planning to conquer China and Russia, and he knew very well that in order to do that, he'd need more than atomic bombs. That he was going to have to kill a hell of a lot of people in order to pull off that. And he saw this as the next go-to weapon of mass destruction.
Wow.
And he wanted this for the U.S. arsenal. So they started looking around. It didn't take very long to discover these Japanese scientists, and they put the strong arm to them that you share with us or we put you on trial. And it was an easy decision for Ishii and his buddies. Of course, we'll take the money and we'll work for the Americans. And they did.
Yeah. And so since when did your parents first realize that the federal government might actually prosecute them?
Well, after the paper folded and we, they returned to the States. I went to the States. It was my first trip.
That's you right here.
Yeah, the little one. Yeah.
Yes.
It became pretty apparent, I think, on the boat ride over. Even they were approached by the CIA, and my dad was offered money to name names and to confess and to become a foreign agent or an agent of the CIA and because they knew that there was a China Friendship Committee and a welcoming group that were going to welcome them home, and they thought that they tried to get him to penetrate and be a snitch for them. And so I think he had an inkling right from the boat ride home that things weren't going to be that easy for him. But he was still young and fairly naive,
And so, wow. And so you were on this boat ride with your father going back to the United States. And so, was the involvement with the government something that your parents talked about openly at home, like the Sedition case and also like what was happening to China Monthly Review?
Well, they were indicted on the sedition charge in 1955 or 56. It was after they'd been back for a couple of years. And my mother got work right away because she was a very skilled office manager. But my dad couldn't get employment with any of the newspapers. He was kind of a persona non gratis. He was blackballed out of the profession, essentially.
Yeah.
And so he made a living. He went on the lecture circuit, and he kind of talked glowingly about China and the new government there. And I think he made a lot of enemies doing that. And then he was called to testify to Congress, and it was a hostile. It was not just information. It was a preparation for an indictment. He faced a very hostile congressional committee that was the Judiciary Committee of Pat McCarran, a senator from Nevada, who was a terrible right-wing guy. He was a supporter of Franco in Spain, and he's a fascist. And his committee, there was a subcommittee on, let's see, it was on subversive activities. It was run by Senator Jenner, and they grilled him. And then it turned out that lead prosecutor of this committee was a trying to remember his name, Carpenter, Alva Carpenter. He was the attorney and the lead prosecutor of the committee. Well, he had been the attorney for the MacArthur and the U.S. government in occupied Japan. That he had actually written a letter to the prosecutor at the war crimes trial saying that these people, Ishii and Wakamatsu and the whole 731 people, they didn't have enough evidence and they weren't going to prosecute. And he got them all off the hook. Wow. So here was the mouthpiece that had actually sprung these horrible war criminals. And now he's prosecuting my dad in front of this Senate committee. And he's just absolutely rabid, calling him a communist sympathizer. And he, at one point, he brought in a POW who had been brutalized by the North Koreans in a POW camp, who called my dad a murderer, you know?
Wow. And it's just so fascinating because just like, less than 2 decades ago, your father was actually working with the United States government to take down Japan, who was a fascist government. And then there he was being tried by, I would say, these like kind of fascist, empathizers who are politicians on being on sedition, on how,
yeah,
that's
an irony.
yes, an irony. And so why sedition? Like, why did the government argue that your father had done, like, went beyond journalism?
Sedition was a law enacted. I'm sure there's history in British law, but in the States, it was the Sedition Act of 1917 was aimed at communist rabble rousers in the labor movement during World War I. And so that was sort of its origins. And so the China Monthly Review was used by the communist guards at the prison camp of mostly American and British and Turkish and Argentine prisoners of war as reading material, that they indoctrinated, that was their that was how they maintained control of prisoners. Wasn't through violence, but it was through education and re-education. And so they used his magazine in the prison camps. And so that was the reason for sedition, because sedition applies to military personnel. If you try to persuade people not to fight or something like that, you can be charged with sedition.
Wow, but then a lot of people on social media could be tried for sedition nowadays, if you think about
it. Yeah, that's true. But sedition has to occur on American soil or in territorial waters, and that's in the statute. But this had occurred over in North Korea, so it was out of the jurisdiction of the law. And so that's why the case got thrown out. Was the prosecutor, a guy named Schnacky, had prosecuted him on the wrong charge. He hadn't read the statute clearly, or he thought he could get away with it. But my parents' attorneys called him on it, objected, and the judge had to agree with her because the statute was very clear that there were limitations of where the seditious act could take place.
Wow. And were your parents actually afraid that they might go to prison at this time?
My dad was, for sure. I mean, he faced 12 counts of sedition, and each count carried a penalty of $10,000 and 20 years in prison. So he could have spent most of his life locked up. My mother probably, if she'd been convicted, would have, since she had 2 small children, might have not, and she had 1 count against her, and she might not have been put in prison. But it was a very frightening time because, the Rosenbergs had been executed for, sharing atomic bomb secrets with the Russians, and that was only the year before.
Mm. And so, what happened during the 1959 trial? I mean, you have mentioned a little bit about it. And so,
It,
how did it end up in a mistrial?
it ended very quickly. First, I want to say my parents had really good defense attorneys. They had two lead attorneys, and really the brilliant party was a woman named Doris Bryn Walker. And she took on the task of securing evidence that was contrary to the indictment. The other was a guy named A.L. Weirin, and he had been a labor lawyer. He was older, and he had been in the legal trenches for years. And his task was to go collect testimony from witnesses that would exonerate what my dad had printed in the news magazine. And so he had to go to China. Well, first of all, the U.S. and China had no judicial agreement since the U.S. did not recognize Red China. So there was no agreement on exchange of testimony or prisoners or any kind of judicial proceedings. And so nobody from China would be given a visa to come to the United States to testify in my parents' defense. So Weirin convinced the judge that then he had to go to China to collect depositions. And at that time, China was closed. The U.S. was not issuing any travel permits to go to China. And so the judge ordered the State Department to give Weirin a passport so that he could go to China. So Weirin went off on what was to be a 3-week trip to take some depositions, and he ended up staying for about, 6 or 8, 10 weeks, something, a longer time. He had a good time. He took a lot of depositions, and he came back with that. And so they were all set and ready to go to ready to go to trial. And then Weirin had a heart attack. And he was put out of commission. So anyway, then the trial started. And then when the prosecutor tried to introduce testimony by soldiers who had been POWs in the internment camps on the Yalu River, that Doris Walker objected. And she said, this testimony is taking place about events that are outside the country, and that the statute clearly reads that events have to be inside of U.S. territory. They can't occur abroad. And so their testimony is not valid. Well, the judge kind of sat up straight and realized, he read the statute and he realized that she was right. And so that meant that half of the witnesses, which were all emotional sort of testimony, not very factual, but emotional testimony to convict my parents, couldn't testify because they only had things to say about their experiences overseas,
Yeah, this is I think there was a political trial, a kangaroo trial, a political show then at this point. And so when the remaining charges were eventually dropped, did your father feel vindicated?
Not really, but let me finish telling you a little bit about, because what happened was that the judge called over the prosecutor for a conference in front of the judge's podium there, and said, hey, look, you're charging this couple on the wrong charge. You should be charging them on treason. You could get a conviction for treason you know? And he said this in open court, and the press is sitting right there in the press box. And the journalist for the Oakland Tribune jumped right up and ran out of the courtroom and phoned his boss and called in the scoop that the judge had just claimed that the Powells were guilty of treason. And so this was in the
Wow.
morning, and by the afternoon, the Oakland Tribune had hit the newsstands all over the Bay Area with this banner headline that the judge had misspoken. He'd said Powell's guilty of sedition. Well,
Wow.
that threw the case right there. You know, that
Wow.
created a problem that you know couldn't fix. And
Wow.
so they had to throw that. And then the prosecutor the next day refiled the case as a treason case, but it didn't go anywhere. And then Bobby Kennedy threw the case out because when he came in office, that was 62, um, because you need two witnesses to corroborate a treasonous act. And where was he going to find them if he didn't go to China, which he could and still do? So, so they quietly swept it under the rug, you
Wow.
know. But they didn't need to actually convict my parents. They got what they wanted, which was to make sure nobody followed up on this story.
Wow. Crazy. And
But you asked me about whether my dad felt vindicated,
yeah.
and I say no, that I don't think so, or he wouldn't have pursued this 15 years later and dragged it out and written it up, you
Yeah.
know?
He actually got a lot right in the I think most of his article was correct for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Um and I was actually quite impressed with like the amount of research that he had done. And I mean, for him to do that in way ahead of the curve must have been so brave. And I actually really appreciate this passage that you had in your book, how Bill kept his sanity. Um, and he kept his sanity because he had friends who were actually in supportive of him. Bill was a gentleman, short in height, emotionally calm, and genuinely friendly. He didn't get angry or blow up. He and Sylvia didn't fight, and he rarely swore. How could he investigate the horrors of Unit 731 without it deeply affecting his personality? I finally realized when I was looking through Sylvia's old date book as he dug into this material, he shared his discoveries with his friends, and that was his means of coping with the ugliness that he was unraveling. I thought that was very, I mean, it's the story behind the story uh, that is so fascinating, that he was the first one that who probably in the United States who heard about it, who wrote about it, then got tried in terms of sedition. If I was him, I would have been so angry. But yeah, so what do you think, like, where should the line be between like reporting an enemy's government's allegation and like so-called spreading enemy propaganda, like what people are were kind of accusing him of doing?
Well, I think you have to sort of start by understanding that all governments lie. And all governments lie as a necessity of their existence, you know. And Thomas Hobbes famously, you know, discussed that governments exist based upon the control of violence, and it's the and so human society, it's argued, doesn't function without laws and police. And so, in order to keep society functioning and all the sort of machinations that required to do that, you need to be able to have rules, and if people don't abide by them, they can be punished. Okay, so in order to protect ourselves from that, the American Constitution is a wonderful document. It establishes free speech and the right of to a fair trial, and that uh, reporters and journalists are understood to be watchdogs of government, and they should report the facts. So we need honest journalists. We need people who are energetic and willing to take on the power structure. That's absolutely necessary if the society is to have any control over its government and to keep its government from becoming tyrannical.
Yeah.
And so I think that a free hand to the press is the best option, and that if the press get it wrong, okay, the government can attack them, and but their attack needs to be based upon facts, and needs to be based upon evidence. It can't just be slanderous, and that's mostly what happens here. And with this particular story about U.S. bacteriological warfare in Korea, the government's response has been continuous denial and continuous slander of people who try to talk about it. It's not produced a single piece of evidence which which supports its conclusions, its argument that all the evidence, and it's mountainous. And I wrote my book is just about the evidence. All points to the contrary, points to the guilt of the U.S. government and the U.S. Army in spreading germs. Well, if it's not true, then show some evidence that disproves it. And when the
Yeah.
government can't do that, it does not have the right to vilify, truth sayers.
Yeah. And I mean, your family is a very good example of it. Your grandfather was imprisoned by one government for his journalism, and then your father was prosecuted, which ended up in mistrial by another. So, what did your family learn what happens? Like when a journalist refuses to tell the story that a government wants to be told?
Well, it's dangerous. You stick your neck out, but it gives you a very interesting life. And I think you have a picture of my mother up here. That's was her goal, and was to have a very interesting life. That right from the very beginning, she got out of the little lumber town of Portland, and made it to the capitals of the world. She lived in Washington, D.C., and New York City, and Shanghai, and San Francisco. She had a wonderful, interesting life. Yes, it was fraught with dangers and choices, but that was, she wasn't satisfied with, a small town existence.
Wow. Well, nowadays Portland is kind of exciting, and
It is.
yeah. Wow, this has been very eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us again this week. And next week you're coming back to talk about your own research. And yeah, and also this is the book we were talking about, the Secret Ugly. So if the viewers can feel free to pick up a copy. I'll also put it in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Jenny.